Well, hey, you guys, welcome to the Connection Point Worldview podcast. My name is Ron. I'm a teaching pastor at the church, and I'm here as always with Dr. Zach Breitenbach and Pastor Trey Shigley, who make up our Worldview team here at Connection Point. And this is a series we're working through right now for both middle school and high school. Dr. Zach, can you remind the listeners of what you're doing in this series and introduce the topic we'll be discussing in our final week?
Yeah, so this whole series has been on science and Christianity. Are they friend or foe? How do they interact with each other? So we've talked about how science and Christianity can inform each other, and how Christianity really gives us the motivations and foundations for doing science, how a lot of leading scientists have actually been believers in God and even Christians. We did all that in week 1. Week 2, we got into several biblical teachings that are supported by science, and we kind of dove into that. Then the last week, we did a panel discussion with some scientists that talked about how their faith fits with their career in science. And then this last week, we're talking about evolution. So just that little topic. So we're trying to emphasize that there are some real challenges to this idea of naturalism explaining everything, that purely natural, random, unguided, undirected processes can explain what we see in life. And we talked a little bit about, well, why isn't intelligent design allowed in science? And at least with high school, we didn't have much time in middle school. We also touched on the age of the earth. Another little small topic.
Man, yeah, my goodness. Well, I mean, as a podcast that's designed to take you as a parent or guardian deeper into places your student has already gone, we'll see how deep we can get with you guys today that are listening. But that's quite the spectrum of stuff you've already covered. Throughout history, one of the big reasons God's existence was obvious to most people is that living things seem to be designed with purpose. So God was seen as an amazing designer. Talk about that a bit.
Yeah, so this has not really been that controversial for most of human history, right? When you see a bald eagle just majestically way up high in the sky with eagle eyes, right, swooping down and seeing a fish and just with these talons and grabbing it. When you see the wings and the feathers, you see this kind of thing. You're like, wow, this bird was designed to do that.
Yeah.
Right. And so many examples of this in nature, right? Or the human eye, so many things. So when people would see this, it's like just like when you see a watch or something else that's obviously designed. It's like, well, when I look at the natural world, it's the same kind of thing. Just like I can see the components of a watch that look like they all fit together, and someone intricately designed this to work just the way it does. Well, that's what living things look like too. That's what the world looks like when we see it, and that has not been especially controversial through most of human history.
Interesting. But next, you point out how modern evolutionary theory has called design into question. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so since Darwin in the 1800s, this has all been called into question. And so the famous atheist Richard Dawkins, we read a quote from him in the lesson that says, "Biology is the study of complex things that appear to have been designed for a purpose. But Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist." So it looks like there's design, and people have always thought that throughout human history. But now we have a scientific explanation that really explains away God as an intelligent designer.
Got it.
And so now you can be an intellectually fulfilled atheist.
Okay.
It used to be, well, what about design, right?
Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Atheist, you say you don't believe in God, but explain how the bald eagle seems so designed to come down and grab the fish, right? Well, now we've figured out how to explain away the appearance of design.
Interesting. All right. Thanks, Darwin. Pastor Trey. So Darwinian evolution had a huge impact on science, obviously, and also on how people viewed God as the creator. Can you briefly tell us about Darwin and what the theory of evolution actually is?
Yeah. So Darwin lived about 200 years ago, and he had a few observations that really changed the course of history. And one of them is when he's visiting the Galapagos Islands. Kind of famously, he's studying these finches' beaks and realizes that they've been adapted to different purposes, and different sized beaks helped different kind of strains of the finches survive during times of drought. And so he came up with kind of a thing that we now call microevolution, which explains these minor, smaller changes within a species. So like beak sizes, and how these varieties and changes help lead to survival, and the things that are helpful towards survival are passed on. So that's kind of called natural selection. The things that help you survive get reproduced more often, and that passes on to the next generation more and more until it becomes a bigger and bigger thing.
Okay.
So a really cool example of this really quickly is there used to be these moths in England that blended into trees. That was kind of their camouflage.
Yes.
But when the Industrial Revolution
Yes.
started, there's pollution.
I remember this from school.
Yep,
Yeah.
school is a great example. And the trees got darker because of pollution.
Yeah.
And then the moths, over time, they also got darker. And what happened there is that the dark-colored moths survived better, and they were the ones that more often got to pass their genes on to the next generation. After several generations, then all of a sudden you've got the whole kind of group of moths are darker now.
Okay.
And so that's microevolution. Micro meaning small, right? It's on a small scale within a species. But then Darwin starts asking, could this explain everything? Could this explain how we got everything? So he wrote this book called The Origin of Species, and he says, hey, this is how all of the animals that we see, all of the life that we see came from kind of a single source. And so this is what we now call macroevolution, where it's major evolutionary changes where one species comes from a different species altogether. So there's not tiny changes like beak size or color.
Yeah,
but
we're talking
you're
giraffe
actually,
to human or
yes,
whatever.
Yes,
Yeah.
something huge. And there's this tree of life where there's common ancestors. And so that's kind of the thing for Darwin. And he said, if you have enough time, anything could happen. And he's like, I'm not sure how these changes happen, but they happen over time, and different species kind of form into different things. And now modern evolutionary theory, now we know how genes work and DNA, and so how they propose those changes happen are through random genetic mutations, right? These something in your DNA gets changed randomly and by chance, and those lead to actually beneficial changes in the organism that change gets passed on, and you do that over enough time, and you get all this diversity that we get in the world today. So that's kind of like the very brief overview of Darwin and evolution, and particularly what we're looking at today, macroevolution. Is it possible that these changes can happen where there's this tree of life?
All right. Well, I am an idiot in this world, so I'm still tracking with you. So we're on track. I'm feeling okay so far. Zach, you mentioned a couple of big challenges to the idea that blind evolutionary processes are responsible for all of the forms of life we see on Earth. The first challenge had to do with what we see in the fossils. Can you unpack that one for us?
Yeah, so one of the difficulties with this modern evolutionary theory is the fossil record doesn't really support this macroevolution where you've got species coming out of other species, where you've got these small gradual changes within a species that add up, and over time you get these transitional forms where you see a new species sort of emerge out of another one. What you see in the fossil record is there's a period in Earth's history that's called the Cambrian period.
Okay.
And so what happened during the Cambrian period is a lot of complex animal forms appeared very suddenly. And so this is called the Cambrian explosion. Nothing actually exploded, but what happened is there was
exciting.
that would be exciting. No animals blew up in this process. But during the Cambrian period of Earth's history, there was an explosion of new complex life. Most of the different animal groups or body shapes that we see today, or the phyla, they appear very suddenly. And when I say very suddenly, this is like in 0.5% of the time that life has been on Earth, right? Which, if you go by the standard dating, right, of Earth's about 4.5 billion years old, this is like a period of like 13 to 25 million years, and that sounds like a lot of time. But for all these animals to appear, these very diverse forms, this is this is a lot. And it doesn't match up with the slowly branching tree, right? The idea that there's very slow changes over time, very gradual building up over time. You just very suddenly, in about 0.5% of the time life spent on Earth, you see all this happen. And so this requires not only it's difficult to match that with the fossil record, where we see all these animals appear at the same time in the fossil record, but it means there was a ton of new genetic information that came about rapidly, right? These different animals have very different DNA. And so these weren't just small little changes to DNA, a few little mutations here or there. This would be a lot of new genetic information coming about very quickly, relatively quickly. And so you have to ask, well, how is that possible? It doesn't seem that the random genetic mutations and natural selection over time would explain that much
explosion,
new genetic information to explain all these different body plans, body forms that appear so suddenly. And so that is a real challenge.
So next, you explain how random changes to DNA are a poor explanation for all the useful changes that would have to happen for that macro evolution to be true. Trey, you want to take that one?
Yeah. So when we talk about if the mechanism for this change over time are these random genetic mutations that happen in the DNA, what we know is that if you randomly mess with any sort of information, whether it's computer code or maybe sentences, in a book, if you just start changing letters or code, it very rarely produces something that's usable,
right,
much less better than the original.
Right,
and
true.
So if you are into computer code, or for parents listening, maybe some of their kids are getting into it, which is awesome. If you just randomly change, a piece of code, it will break the whole thing, right?
Right.
And it probably for sure won't make it better than it was before unless it's done with intention, right?
Yeah.
And something on purpose, not accidental. So random changes to DNA code, and we see this in our day-to-day life, it is way more likely to cause damage than anything good. And when you look at kind of what it takes, like how many possibilities there are for, I use this example of like your phone passcode. If you've got 4 numbers,
right,
there's a lot of options there, right? It's like 10 to the 4th options.
Yeah.
But when it comes to something like creating protein out of DNA, which then is the building blocks of like kind of the cells and the organisms and the kind of the organs that make up people.
Yes.
The DNA forms directly into that, and the number of possible like good combinations of protein to the number of ones that will fail is insane. It's 1 out of 10 to the 77th.
Yikes.
Which is not good odds at all. So there's no way that random changes to DNA could produce a new species even after billions of years, because that's like the equivalent of picking a random atom out of our entire universe. That's 10 to the 77th atoms in the universe is an estimate there.
Okay.
So that's the odds of getting one protein sequence that's usable.
Yeah.
Now we're saying that needs to happen over and over and over again to form all of these changes over time. And the amount of time, even if you have billions and billions of years, isn't even close to the amount of time you'd need to randomly create that many sequences of usable, and not just usable, but improving DNA code.
Man.
And so that just doesn't even match up with the science or with the mathematical odds.
Well, if it was 10 to the 76th power, I might believe it. But the 77th, that's where I draw the line.
That's where they lose you.
That's where I'm going. But what about this argument? We've heard this argument of common descent. All living things have a DNA code. We all share that in common. Not only that, these living things, some of them share quite a bit of DNA information in common, like humans share 98 to 99% of DNA with chimps, and 60% of DNA with bananas, which
yes, which is crazy.
It is a little bit disheartening. Isn't this evidence of common descent?
Well, you could view it as evidence of common descent, but what I think is a more accurate way of viewing it is viewing it as evidence for a common designer. And Ron, I know you have a Jeep, right?
Yeah.
And what are the Jeeps that are like trucks? What are those called?
Gladiator.
Gladiators.
Yeah,
Oh
yes.
man, that's a real,
Yeah.
strong name.
It is.
Now, if you saw both of those, you wouldn't think to yourself, oh, wow, someone must have left the Gladiator out in the weather for a long time and it changed into a Jeep.
Right.
Right. You would think, oh, someone designed both of those.
Right.
And that person was similar. They used the same plan. And so this happens with cars all the time, right?
Yes.
They're using same materials, same maybe even the base to start off with, the same software, the same building blocks. Same thing with code. If someone's going to code something new, they'll use old code that they've used as a starting block. And so this points to that there's a common designer behind everything who's using a common blueprint and then putting all these things in a common world. And so our DNA, and as we've seen, like DNA is so detailed and intricate, even a 2% difference is a massive difference.
That's pretty big, yeah.
So it's not something that is a good argument for there being common descent. It's more like an argument for a common designer.
Gotcha. Okay, Dr. Zach, over to you. So macroevolution, it's got its difficulties. Plus, evolution doesn't explain things like the universe's fine-tuning or how the first life began. So can you discuss that for a minute?
Yeah, so that's important to realize that even if macroevolution were true, there are still good evidences for design that have nothing to do with that, right?
Yep.
Like we've talked about this on other podcasts and other lessons, like the universe began to exist. This cries out for a powerful cause beyond the universe that caused it. The universe is fine-tuned for life to exist, right? There's so many factors that are incredibly precise that have to be just what they are, like the strength of gravity, right? Or the expansion rate of the universe and a lot of other things, that if they weren't exactly the way they are, you couldn't have life anywhere in the universe. And it seems like life is set up that way. And this really is true independent of evolution, right? So you still have to deal with a lot of this. Plus, you have to deal with how the first life began. Because evolution is not an explanation for how the first life began. The
beginning.
Right? Now, there is so-called chemical evolution, which is trying to explain how you get from non-living components, how do you get the first living thing, maybe with an evolutionary process. No one's even begun to explain that because what we've discovered, the more we discover about DNA and its complexity, the more we've discovered about a single cell, which, Darwin had no idea that a cell is like a universe of complexity within it, just a single cell with all sorts of components doing all kinds of things and with massive amounts of information packed into it. You have to get the first living thing. And science has no idea how you can do that. Not only is it just ignorance, where it's like, well, we haven't figured it out yet, but the more we learn about a cell and DNA, the more we're like, there's no way that in the time it took from the beginning of the Earth, even if you accept the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and life appeared, say, 4 billion years ago to 3.5 billion years ago, even if you got 500 million to 1 billion years, that is not nearly enough time for the first cell, the first living cell to evolve, given how complex a cell is.
Gotcha.
That is a huge, huge problem. And so evolution doesn't explain that. It assumes, well, there is a first living cell that's capable of reproducing, and then evolution takes over, right? And then there's random changes to the DNA and natural selection, everything we already talked about. It's trying to explain what Darwin called the origin of the species, not the origin of life, right?
Yeah.
How do you get all the different species in the world, not how do you get the first living thing? And so that is a huge problem. So we need to keep that in mind, that even if someone is convinced, there's a lot going for evolutionary theory, that doesn't mean there isn't still really good reason to believe in intelligent design. And I do think evolution has difficulties, like we've talked about.
Right. So if living things seem to require intelligent design, why isn't intelligent design considered in science today?
Yeah, it can be frustrating sometimes when thinking about it, because it's like, well, it's got some obvious issues, and there seems to be a lot of valid things pointing to intelligent design. So why isn't it even considered an option, or taught as an option, or a valid way of viewing things?
Right.
And so science has kind of created a stance to say we will only consider natural causes for explaining things.
Okay.
Which on one hand kind of makes sense because that's what science is studying.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, that is seriously limiting them to be able to follow the evidence wherever it might lead.
Yeah.
And so as Christians, what's great is that we can evaluate all of the evidence and see where it leads us.
Okay.
And we are searching for truth. And that's what science should be, right? A
Yes.
search for what is ultimately true. And so why restrict science to not be able to include even the possibility or theory of intelligent design? Because that's seriously putting a handicap on what they're able to explore and where they're able to find or follow the evidence. Even if the evidence is pointing really strongly towards intelligent design, they're going to have to be creative and figure out other ways to explain certain things that we as Christians can feel really comfortable with following the evidence.
Yeah.
And it seems to be pointing to God, right?
Yeah.
Well, there must be a God,
Yeah.
right? And so what's great about being a follower of Jesus is that we have that option open to us, and looking at the evidence, we're able to just follow the natural conclusion of what we observe scientifically.
I like that. Well, all right, Dr. Zach, let's see how you can handle this in a brief, succinct manner. For this next topic, which you only had time to touch on briefly in middle school, but you hit on maybe a little more for high school. You covered something that can be controversial for some Christians, and that is the age of the earth. You emphasize that Christians who follow the Bible can disagree on this topic. So can you talk to us about that a little bit? Age of the earth.
Yeah, this is very controversial, especially for some Christians that feel very strongly about this. I do believe it is a secondary or even tertiary issue compared to the one we've been talking about so far. So far, we've been talking about, is there an intelligent designer, right? Did God create living things? Did God make the world? And I think we have good evidence that he did, and that's really what's critical, right? The big enemy here is naturalism, right? That there's no supernatural involvement, there's no designer God or anything like that. And so that's what we've spent most of our time here talking about. But a lesser issue is, well, when did God make everything, right? And some Christians feel very strongly that there's clues in the Bible that this is fairly recent, that maybe within the last 6,000 to 10,000 years, God made all life on earth, including humans. And this is usually called young earth creationism. But this is not the only view. And we shouldn't think that to be a biblically faithful Christian, there's only one view you can take. And so other Christians, without necessarily even believing in any kind of evolutionary process that God used, you don't have to believe that to think the earth is older.
Right.
But some Christians do think, well, the earth is older, and this is a separate issue to evolution, right? Is when did God create? And some Christians challenge the idea that the Bible gives us these clues that the earth is only thousands of years old, right? So why would someone read the Bible and think that the earth is maybe, say, 6,000 years old? Well, there's a few reasons that would lead somebody to that. One would be you don't think there's any gap in time between the first verse of the Bible and the second, right? The first verse, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. He made the universe, and the earth exists eventually. Well, then how long after that did God start doing things on the earth, right? So verse 2 in Genesis 1 starts talking about, well, the earth was formless and empty, and there was darkness over the surface of the deep, and God was hovering over the waters. Well, how long after verse 1 where God made everything and made the earth, how much time passed between then and when God starts doing things with the creation days? Well, if you assume, well, there wasn't much time there, that's going to be critical to coming up with, the earth is very young, and you'll see that here in a second as I unpack it. But that is going to be the first interpretation that you'd have to have. The second thing is you would look at the creation days that are described, and there's 6 days of creation and the seventh day where God rested. And you would have to think that the creation days are 6 consecutive 24-hour days,
Right.
just ordinary solar days
Right.
of
Literal.
24 hours, literal days
Yeah.
that are consecutive with no time in between them,
Yeah.
and that sort of thing. And then the third thing that comes into play here is you look at some of the genealogies that are described in Genesis, especially in chapters 5 and 11, where it says, this person is the son of this person, is the son of this
Yes.
person. And it tells how many years each of these people lived, right?
Yeah.
And so if you assume that these genealogies are complete, they didn't leave anything out.
It's all comprehensive. Nobody's left.
It's all comprehensive. No one's left out, and you add up all the ages,
Yeah.
right? Then it tells you from Adam all the way through to Abraham how many years it's been, right? And you know how long ago Abraham lived, and that's how you calculate when Adam lived, right? And so if you accept all three of the things I just said, then the whole earth would be something like 6,000 years old, right? Because we can figure out when Adam lived from the genealogies, and we say that was like 6,000 years ago. And if you think that all the creation days happened in the same literal week, and even the earth itself, there's no gap of time between God made the universe and the earth and when he started doing things on the creation days.
Because a day is a day.
Yeah, then the whole world, the whole universe was created the same week the humans were made and every other
Yeah.
living thing. And we know when that was. It was 6,000 years ago because we've added up the ages, of all the people in the genealogy. So that's how you get that, right?
Yeah.
And so is that a valid way of reading the Bible? Yeah, that's a valid interpretation that you could have, and Christians do hold that, and that's fine. But what I would emphasize is that there are challenges to those.
Yeah.
And you have to accept, really all three of those things to have any confidence of how old the earth is. The Bible never gives us a verse where it tells us exactly how old the earth is. Or it says, Moses writing this, and it was X number of years ago before I'm writing this that God created the heavens and the earth, or God made humans. There's nothing like that. If it said that, there'd be no debate.
Yes.
And we'd all know exactly how old the earth is and when Adam was made and all of that. But we don't have that. So it comes down to whether you accept those three interpretations I just said, that together the logic of them leads to the earth is like 6,000 years old. But if you challenge any of those, if you have biblical reason to think any of those are not the case, then the logic of that would break down and you wouldn't really know how old the earth is.
Tracking with you.
And so, this is something we could go into time on. We don't have much time to go into all the details here, but I would say that there are some clues that not all of this is all three of those assumptions are the case, and it's not just like people in the modern day with modern science started questioning those three interpretations. Even if you go back to someone like St. Augustine, who lived in the 300s to 400s A.D., a famous Christian who lived back then, long before anyone knew about modern science or any of the controversy going on now with evolution or anything else. He thought there were biblical reasons for not taking the creation days, for example, to be a literal week. So things like the fact that the sun isn't created till day 4, and it says when the sun is created that the sun is used to mark seasons, days, and years. And it specifically says that is the perfect purpose of the sun. If that's the case, then what about the first 3 days?
Right.
And so Augustine's looking at this and is like, I'm not sure these were meant to be solar days because there wasn't even a sun for the first 3 days.
Right.
And the purpose of the sun is to mark days.
Yeah.
So what does it mean that there's days before there were the sun to mark days?
Yeah.
And so he was like, I don't think this was meant to be literal solar days. And I think this is not just, he wasn't basing that on any kind of modern science at all.
Yeah.
He was just looking at the biblical text, and he thought, well, this is a clue in the text itself that maybe these days are not meant to be solar days and to be taken literally. And so he was not convinced of sort of a literal 6 days. So we could go into some other challenges to these days and other ways that people have interpreted them, but I don't think we need to do that here. My point would just be this: charity for Christians who might disagree, and really look into this, right? Look
Right,
into
right.
it and study the Bible for yourself, and don't just dismiss out of hand somebody else's view. Take it seriously and look at it and say, okay, well, yeah, that the whole thing with the sun, yeah, that's a challenge. But I think there's other good reasons why I think these are consecutive,
Yeah.
solar
Yeah.
days, or say, well, no, this is a kind of a challenge to this in the Bible itself, that these are literal solar days, and there's some other clues that people would point to that they're not literal, and maybe you end up not thinking these were consecutive days. What we want to emphasize is that this is the truth of Christianity does not hang on this.
Yeah.
Right? This is not a core issue like the resurrection of Jesus,
Yeah.
where the Bible actually says in 1 Corinthians that if this did not happen, this one thing, then the whole Christian faith is a bunch of bunk.
It's in vain. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's not like that. Let's have some charity for people. It's not that this doesn't matter, but the age of the earth is much less important than that God did create, that there's not just natural processes without God's involvement, and have charity for others who may disagree with you. But take the Bible seriously and study it for yourself.
I like that, because I think it's hallmarks of this podcast, and certainly your worldview ministry at Connection Point, is those two things. One, to really study this stuff, ask the tough questions, be willing to wrestle, be willing to study and research and glean from all these different perspectives. And then when there are differences that are not essential issues, then have charity. I like that a lot, you guys. So, Trey, what's a question related to this lesson that parents can discuss with their students?
Yeah, a great one would be it's a question kind of about a recap of what we talked about, but just asking a student, what are some good reasons to think that life didn't come about by blind natural processes without an intelligent designer? That'd be a great question. And then another thing to kind of note is, if your students took their notes home that we gave them, on the back we put 4 different QR codes, or 3 or 4 different QR codes with links to more videos. If you're like, man, I really like this theory, I want to dive into it deeper, you scan that, you can go watch it with your student. They're 10 to 15 minutes long, kind of a deeper dive into these different aspects that we covered briefly here. So that would be a kind of a secondary thing to do on your own or with your student.
Super helpful, guys. This was a phenomenal series. If you missed any part of this one on how Christianity and science kind of reconcile with each other, you can go back and catch previous episodes. If you got questions about the church, Connection Point, you can go to connectionpoint.org. That's point with an E, connectionpoint.org, and get some questions answered, or reach out to us if you might need anything. Otherwise, please know we love you. We're praying for you and your students. God bless.